Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you very, very much. I hope you will join us for our upcoming course, the course on anti-Semitism, an incredible view. And I think the one thing that I'm enjoying about preparing for this lecture is the richness, not just so much to see our people identified and defined by all the hate, but to be able to dig into all the good and new ways to explore the issue, to respond to the issue for us, for our children, and for our communities. And that's starting November 2nd. But tonight, we're jumping ahead. Bis 120, they say, until 120. And the big question is, what happens after 120? And so for that very important, deep, and broad issue, in a short period tonight, we have my wonderful and scholarly nephew, Rabbi Sholom D, Notik, who is not only my nephew, but a Chabad rabbi, a teacher and lecturer on Jewish topics, and how they are relevant and connect to contemporary life. Rabbi Notik and his wife, Sarala, proudly serve the Jewish community in Riverwoods, Illinois, otherwise known as Chicago, where they reside with their children. And before we do bring Rabbi Notik on, I'd like to say, as the evening goes, you can chat directly with me, any questions, and I will save time. So as thought comes to your head, just put it out there. Just give me the question. Don't put it on the main chat, like to disturb everyone. And then I will ask Rabbi Notik the questions, and hopefully we'll have also chance after to directly ask the questions of Rabbi Notik. So without further ado, Rabbi Notik.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Drizin, and thank you everybody who's with us tonight. You know, they say that the rabbi, in one of those many occasions, was in conversation with other religious leaders, and they somehow start talking about what they wanted their obituary to sound like, and what do they want people to say by their own funeral. And, you know, the priest gets up and he says, I hope that they mention and talk about the way I looked out for the community, the way I was so dedicated to others, to bettering people's lives. And the minister follows quickly on his heels and he said, all that is nice, but I hope they also stress how I looked after my own family, my loved ones, never forgetting them, even with everything I was busy with for others. Finally, it becomes the rabbi's turn. And he just says, you know, I hope that at my funeral, someone gets a little too close to the casket and suddenly screams, he's moving. Because jokes aside, this really underscores the Jewish perspective. As much as we'll talk about afterlife and after 120, Judaism is really about this life as we know it today, and the life that we live. Ultimately, this is where it's all happening, and this is what really counts. That's why, of course, virtually all, although not absolutely all, but almost all mitzvahs will be suspended in case of any danger to life. Because again, life is more important even than the afterlife. So we'll try to keep in mind, as much as we'll talk about afterlife, that we're really trying to learn how it's relevant to life, how it's relevant to me and you and all of us today, here and now, who are hopefully happy and healthy for many, many years to come. So the starting point for all of that is a story, which personally is one of my favorites. I can imagine that my congregants here have probably had enough of it, but I really think it underscores a core truth. You know, in a little bit of Chabad history, so the third Rebbe, who was known as the Tzemach Tzedek by the name of his book, was actually orphaned at the age of 3. So he was raised by his grandfather, who was the founder of Chabad, the first Rebbe, the one who came up with this whole concept. And that gives us a wealth of stories and tidbits and all kinds of interesting things that happen when this little boy is being raised by this illustrious sage. And on one occasion, the little future Rebbe is sitting on his grandfather's lap, and his grandfather kind of starts playing with him. And he tells the boy, "Where's Zayda? Where's grandfather?" And the boy points right at him, I guess towards his head. And Rabbi just says, "That's not Zayda, that's Zayda's head. Where's grandfather?" So he says, if head is not good, he tries his chest. And again, grandfather just says, "That's not Zaydi, that's Zaydi's chest." And you keep trying, and he never gets past that problem. So he does what little boys do, which is moves on to the next game. But this little boy was different. After just a few minutes of playing around in the room, he suddenly gets his fingers caught in the door, or at least pretends to. And he screams out, "Zayda!" His grandfather turns and says, "What happened?" And the little boy says, "That is the Zayd, the one who turned to address me when it really concerned him." What this means, in other words, is really a profound reality about ourselves. Because the real me and the real any of us is not a specific part of ourselves, not a specific part of our bodies or our biology, and it's not even the sum total of all of it together. There is a deeper self that owns or operates or is the one functioning within all of that. It's the owner of the Zaydi's head and the Zaydi's hands and all the things that we do. It's the identity behind that all. And that, of course, is our soul. Now, I think, practically speaking, most people intuitively believe in the concept of a soul. But nevertheless, the theory is out there that there isn't really an independent, what we call soul, but that our sense of identity, our sense of consciousness, our sense of self is just a product of our biology, of neurons running around, making us feel that way, but it's not really a independent soul or sense of personal identity beyond our physical bodies. So just to respond to that, I'll stress that the Torah is unequivocal that there is a soul, an actual soul, which is something beyond anything of our physical life. And where do we see that? Where does the Torah actually say that? That's in the very beginning, in the story of creation of Adam. If you pay close attention, when the Torah says how Adam is created, well, Adam is not created just ready to go, but God fashions the first human out of clay, creating a clay dummy, and only then adds the soul, as the Torah specifically tells us the story, enlivening, energizing, and bringing him to life as the human that we know. So there's actually, in the Torah's perspective, a presence of a soul, which is something additional to the actual body. And that makes all the difference. Because if the way we feel, if our sense of self, if our identity would have just been a product of our physical condition and our cells and whatever is the makeup of our brains, then unfortunately, as soon as the body would be gone, that sense of identity would be gone as well. But because we understand that there's an actual soul, and my sense of self, my core, is beyond that physical body, well, then the logic would dictate, as the Rebbe once wrote, that it doesn't disappear just because the body succumbed to cardiac arrest. The body will ultimately die by its nature, but that soul, which is the spiritual energy behind it, doesn't have to be associated with that. So what's the answer to our original question? Just to remind us what our original question is, and that is, do Jews believe in afterlife? And before COVID, I was giving a course at here in Chicago at the National Louis University, and I come in one week, and it's a lifelong learning course. So the participants are retirees, and we're getting ready, we're getting settled in, and an older Jewish woman of the more vocal type comes almost charging in and barely manages to sit down before she exclaims our question. And she says, Rabbi, do Jews believe in afterlife? And why is it bothering her so much? Because she was at a funeral, unfortunately, and the rabbi spoke about afterlife. And she says, I thought we didn't believe in that stuff. That sounds like a different religion. How do you answer that without shocking her in the 90 seconds we had before the class begins? Well, the correct answer would be that we don't believe in that afterlife. The stuff that's out there that people might imagine in popular culture or another religion, that there's somewhere else we're going to go, there's some part two where we're going to have a great time or a terrible time, is not really the Jewish perspective. But we do understand that a soul doesn't die along with its body. The soul continues to be in its original spiritual existence. That spiritual existence is not dependent on the host, which is the body. And that is what continues to live on and experience what we may call afterlife, even when the body is gone. So, in a nutshell, yes, there is an afterlife in that spiritual sense of a totally holy spiritual experience of the soul. But I think that what most people want to know and what's on most people's minds when you ask about an afterlife is really not that abstract. And in fact, one of the most meaningful questions that I get, and I'm sure it's not only me as a rabbi, is about this. When people want to know, am I still connected to the loved one who is gone? Do we still have a relationship? Do we still have a connection? Do we still have a bond? Or is it just in my head and they're gone? Even if their soul exists in some spiritual sense, are they connected to me? And am I connected to them? In fact, I've gotten this question from the other direction, where an elderly individual in his very last days wants to understand if he, on the other side, will still be connected to his children. And ultimately, the question is the same. Do we maintain a connection with that soul? It's nice that there's a spiritual identity that lives on in some spiritual concept. Are we bonding, connecting, related to that in any way? And the answer to that is also yes. But let's examine this a little bit. Let's try to understand. In life as we know it, in the life in the physical world, on planet Earth, and our society and our lives, the soul that we're talking about is fully engaged, fully fused with the body, and is completely invested in the body and in its senses. And that means that every experience that the soul has during the lifetime of the human being is happening through the body. The soul cannot have an experience without that medium, without the tool that the body is, one of its senses, its capabilities to think, to feel, to do, to come and go. This is what Kabbalah calls enclosed. The soul is clothed into the body. Now, we call it clothing, but that's not as simple as changing a suit, but it really becomes one. So say I want to connect with a loved one who's living with us in this world. Anybody, a sibling, a dear friend, might come from out of town, from far away. We haven't seen each other in who knows how long. How are we going to bond? How are we going to connect? Well, you might go for dinner somewhere, go for coffee, sit together in one form or another. How does the connection happen? Where, if we can say that, is the connection taking place? Is it because we're sitting at the same table? Do we need to order the same dishes? Where do we bond? Now, obviously, our bond is happening inside. Obviously, the bond happens in the soul's condition and at the soul's dimension of ourselves. It's the deeper part of me that wants to connect to the other. And all of this table and anything else we have is just a tool to facilitate warm and comfortable conversation. Even the conversation itself is not the real bond, but just a physical tool that we use to hear the other, to communicate with the other, to connect with the other. So the real connection and the real association, the real relationship is one of the soul. But we absolutely must have those physical tools, that human expression that allows one soul to connect to the other. If I just sat at home and said, my soul is connected with my spouse, connected with my friend, connected with my loved one, that's nice, but nobody would experience that connection. So now what happens when one of those souls leaves the body? When one of the two pass on? They obviously can't go out for coffee anymore. Although they famously say that the fellow would show up in the bar every evening and take 2 shots. And the bartender finally asks him, what are the 2 shots about? I can give you 1 double if you like. He says, no, I had a dear friend. I lost him in war and I can never forget him. Every night I toast myself, and another toast is on behalf of my friend. It's not mine, it's his. Years go by with this wonderful practice until finally one evening, the fellow comes in and orders just 1 shot. And the bartender looks at him and says, what's this? What could have possibly changed? He says, no, everything is fine. That's my friends, and I stopped drinking. But of course, we can no longer sit at the table with that loved one after he or she is gone. But the connection is not gone. The connection was never really about the coffee. And the connection was never really about the conversation. The connection was always at the soul's level and in the soul's reality. And that part continues to exist. The soul used to require those physical human tools that we all know and live with to connect. Now it no longer does. The soul that's been unshackled from that body that it was always fused with, after hopefully many, many years, that soul is now in a position to experience a relationship and experience a connection right where it is. As soon as that soul experiences the bond, the love, the sense of connection to the other, it's complete. It doesn't need that physical communication to do that. Now, it's hard for us to imagine, because what is that supposed to mean? Obviously, in our reality, that we require the definitions, the properties of our lives to do anything. And there's no such thing as a relationship that doesn't involve communication and physical connection. But the soul, understandably, has no need for all of that. Of course, that's on the soul's end. What about on my end? What about the grieving partner in this world who's lost their loved one, who cannot experience soul experiences? So the truth is that here's where the real challenge lies. Of course, the connection, the bond will never feel the same. We miss going for coffee with him or her. We miss that kind of experience. But it would be very helpful for us to remember that the real connection is unchanged. That soul is complete and continuing to live in its original spiritual state. And that soul's bond with us remains complete, in fact, even more pure. It's only the physical expression that's missing. That means the other side of the relationship has it in its completion and might be feeling for me right now. And if we tune into our own souls and try to focus inwards on that, and not so much on the tools of life as we know it, if we try to let go of that physical part for a moment and think about that deeper bond, we might in some way sense it. So in other words, a real separation, a real disconnect would only be possible for 2 people that are actually both alive, but somehow cannot communicate. If one of the partners is, I don't know, kidnapped by ISIS, in a locked position, cannot communicate by any way, shape, or form, then there's a real separation. Because each of those 2 require human tools of communication and connection to find each other, to associate and bond with each other, and they cannot do so. But if one of them is actually passed on, their soul has been released from that paradigm. That soul now experiences the relationship without any tools, and we have to do our best to try to be a part of that. So when people ask, can I connect with my loved one? Or when people ask, I feel a sense of love and a sense of relationship with a departed family member, is it real or is it my imagination? Now, of course, nobody knows if it's their imagination or not, but it could be real. It could be a true sense of you feeling what's in your soul and sensing that the other side of a relationship is also feeling that right now. But personally, what I find fascinating and really powerful about the ongoing relationship and that ongoing connection is a couple snippets from the Talmud and the Zohar about the soul's journey and what is going on with the soul after its passing. I'm going to read that in its original. It's really brief, so bear with me. But the Zohar says, for 7 days, the soul goes from the house where it lived to the grave, and from the grave back to the house, and it mourns its body. After 7 days, the body is subjected to its fate, and the soul ascends to its place. So 7 days, the soul is kind of not sure where to go, not sure where to find the body at home, in a grave. And after 7 days, the soul kind of gives up and moves on. Well, we'll also see that it's not necessarily 7 days, because the Zohar continues. For 30 days, the soul and body are judged as one. So the judgment, whatever that means, is a shared experience for both soul and the body. And thus the soul is located down here on earth. The soul remains somehow associated with this earth for 30 days because it is still undergoing a review of sorts in which it's a partner with the body. After that, the soul ascends while the body erodes in the earth. 30 days have gone by, the body is starting to decompose, the soul moves on. And finally, the Talmud says in the Tractate of Shabbos, for 12 months, the body still exists, and the soul ascends and descends. After 12 months, the body becomes null, and the soul rises and no longer returns. So obviously, these are different stages in a transition of the soul from being one, the real one that we might all imagine or hope for in marriage, the real, really fused with the body. The soul is transitioning from that to being separated from that and in a totally spiritual experience. And that's happening in those stages. 7 days, it kind of doesn't let go. And for 30 days, it's still somewhat in this world. And for 12 months, still shuttling back and forth. And finally, the separation is complete. What does that remind us of? Does this sound familiar to anyone? I'm sure it does. I'm sure that those of us who've experienced it and done, tried to follow the Jewish tradition the best of our ability in mourning and in the afterlife rites will recognize this as Shiva, the first 7 days, the Shloshim, the first 30 days, and then the full year of mourning. Each of those are stages in how we mourn, what we do or don't do, how we remember, and then, of course, how we connect. But what fascinates me is how that corresponds exactly to the soul's experience. We're not just doing that for us, because humans need time. Living people need time to adjust and go through the stages of grief. That's true too, and that's critical too. But we are actually accompanying and supporting the soul in its own stages of transition. We're coming along in the soul's journey, and what we do matters to the soul. So it's not just that there is a bond, and there is still a relationship in where relationships really happen in the spiritual place of the soul. But that relationship is so real that we can participate, we can support, we can cheer along, if you will, the soul as it goes through its transitions. And we do that by the traditions that we observe here at each of those stages. That's really why the Talmud and all the Jewish writings are telling us to observe these traditions. This is a little peek at what's happening in another dimension, and really they're guiding us to contribute as needed to make the difference that we can make to the soul. Now we're going to discover a little bit later on just how much we can contribute and how important that contribution is. But as an aside, I would just, maybe not such an aside, stress that this idea is why following the Jewish tradition in burial and mourning, and especially burial, is so important. Because there's a whole experience of the soul that we're mostly unaware of. And we could either be supporting that, we could either continue to be that loving family member, dear friend, who's there to help and support the other, or we can, God forbid, hurt that in some way, shape, or form. Especially most tragically in the case of cremation. Just imagine a soul trying to adjust to its new reality. Because remember those stages we talked about, and many more stages that exist, is a soul letting go of a body which it called home, and not only home, but it called itself for 100 years, hopefully 120. You're cutting the soul in half. The soul is being separated from part of itself. That body was me. Now that soul is being removed from that. That's a painful and challenging process. And that's why the soul's hovering around and trying to come to terms with it, and maybe trying to revisit the body. And it takes all this time for all this to take place. Now imagine if tragically people come along, and it's usually done with the best of intentions. So it's not to demean anyone, God forbid. But people come along not recognizing that, take that body and burn it. That is actually described as torturous to the soul who still feels connected to that body. The body is supposed to decompose naturally at its natural pace, which is the same pace at which the soul adjusts to its new reality, as we've been pointing out. So in addition to many important reasons in Jewish tradition, why we bury the way we do, and why cremation is such a no-no, and Judaism considering that a real tragedy, which we won't get into now, and definitely not to reference anybody's choices that have already been made in the past, but on top of that, at a personal human level, destroying the body actually causes the soul to suffer, and that's something that obviously none of us want to do. So let's go from there to the idea of grave visitation. We talked about the soul living on. We've talked about our connection living on. We've talked about being a part of the soul experience. But when we visit a grave, who is that for? What is that for? Is it just for me? Is it for the visitor? A sense of nostalgia, a sense of connection, just in our experience? Or is there really a bond there? A wonderful old Jewish woman calls the rabbi and says, "Rabbi, I got to talk to you about those arrangements for when the time comes." And he says, "Sure, I'm here for you." And they talk about a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And the rabbi takes notes, tries to assure her that everything will be done in the best possible way, and wishes her continued health. Don't keep this on your mind. But then the woman says, "And then I want to be buried at Bloomingdale's." And the rabbi just looks at her, "Why would you want to do a crazy thing? I mean, you've always tried to follow Jewish tradition. Obviously, we don't do that. Nobody does that. What's gotten into you?" Doesn't know. I need some way to ensure that my daughters will visit me at least once a week. That's the only place they'll go. So visiting the grave, does the departed benefit from that? Does the departed individual pay any attention to that? And the answer is, again, yes. In fact, the Zohar gives us a whole formula for how this works. based on the idea that there are multiple dimensions to a soul. If you pay close attention, and this is only for the sharp-eyed, but if you pay close attention in the Torah and other Jewish writings, you notice a soul has more than one name. We typically call the soul a neshama, but a soul can also be called nefesh. A soul can also be called ruach, which would mean spirit. There's more than one name used in the original texts. Why? It's not just a synonym, but these are different dimensions to a soul. Specifically, what we call nefesh is the point where the soul and the body merge, the point where the fusion takes place. Then there are deeper dimensions to the soul. There's the soul's emotional experience, its capacity to feel, which is called ruach in the Hebrew. Don't worry if you forget those names. And the soul's intellectual capacity, which is called neshama. Now, if somebody dies and the body no longer functions, the nefesh, the point of the soul where the fusion to the body took place, is basically discontinued. It no longer has a role to play. Those emotions, the intellectual experience, the deeper identity of the soul is what we've been talking about lives on, but that capacity to connect to a body is retired. There's not much left for that. Engagement with the body is no longer relevant. This is why King Solomon, describing death, writes, Haruach toshuv el Elokim, the spirit returns to God. The ruach dimension of the soul is what is now in a spiritual experience. Its nefesh dimension is not much of anything at all anymore. The ruach is what's now freed of the body, but the nefesh never can be. And therefore, the nefesh is that part of the soul that, as the Zohar describes it, remains in the grave. Now, there's nothing in the grave, and souls are spiritual and they can't be in any place. But obviously, that means that this most basic dimension of the soul maintains an association with the body and with the soul, even beyond all the stages we talked about earlier. And this is why grave visitation has meaning and power. The Zohar says something that sounds cryptic, but thinking about it, it actually makes a lot of sense. The Zohar says when you visit the grave, you communicate with that nefesh dimension, that most basic dimension of a soul. And that shell of the soul, if you will, communicates with the deeper presence of the soul in its true spiritual reality and brings our prayer before God. Now, what does that mean? Well, what it might mean in our terms is imagine you're having a conversation with someone in 2021. And that means that the conversation partner has a 21st century attention span, which is somewhere close to zero. So you talk to them, but after a minute or two, you say they're not really there. Of course, they're there, but their mind is elsewhere. They're thinking about something else. They're texting someone. They're gone. Well, you might say, hello, are you here? And you might try to catch that individual's attention and bring them back. Well, what actually happened? Well, the other person never really left. They were there in front of you the whole time. Their deeper part, their attention and their mind got busy with something else. And by shaking up that little shell that remained, by shaking up the part of them that was still at the table, by calling them to attention, you can bring the deeper part back. So when we visit a grave and the Zohar says we're connecting to that most superficial part of the soul that retains an association with the body, that's like us giving a little tug and saying, hello, are you there? And calling the person, just like we call our conversation partner, calling from the shell that's in front of us back to the deeper part of the person. So imagine the other guy got up and left the table. Well, then it wouldn't help you to call their name, and it wouldn't help you to bring them back. Going to the gravesite is to have that little bit there from which we can pull on to the rest and actually connect to it and reinforce our own bond. So yes, there's a real bond taking place That's why there are traditions that accompany that, and that's why there's so much respect for the grave and for that visit. But for all we've discussed, what about the soul's experience after passing? It's nice the soul lives on, and it's nice that we can connect, and that's probably most important. But what's happening with the soul? What's this afterlife? Is there a heaven and a hell? What does that mean anyway? So, of course, if you read in many, many different Jewish texts, you will discover Gan Eden and Gehenna, which might be translated as heaven and hell. So there's something there in Jewish tradition. But what is it and what is it not? Well, in brief, or let's say in very brief, the first thing to know is that there's no such thing as eternal destruction or damnation or anything of that sort in Jewish tradition. It's not a Jewish idea, and it doesn't actually exist in our understanding. No souls ever get banished and destroyed and condemned. That doesn't actually take place. There's no eternal hell. The maximum that a soul might suffer, and we'll try to talk about what that means, is 12 months. Which is why we say Kaddish during the first year, but actually only for 11 months. Because we assume, and we should all always assume, that our loved one was a decent human being, and only the most wicked might suffer for 12 months. Our Kaddish is a prayer to support the soul in a difficult time. And therefore, we're choosing to do that for 11 months, assuming that maybe this individual has a couple stuff to take care of, but not that much, nothing more than 11 months. And in fact, as we'll discover, it's usually much shorter than that. So let's understand what it's all about before we get carried away with a bit too spiritual. I once heard an excellent analogy. A couple, a husband and a wife, they've gone through, let's say, a stressful period, I don't know, the lockdown, you name it, and they've decided the time has come to finally go on that dream vacation. They're going to go to Hawaii or pick your destination, the Himalayas, whatever it is, for 2 weeks, and in a beautiful resort, and it's all inclusive. It's a dream. It's going to be heaven. It's going to be really special. Well, then, a week before they're scheduled to go, somebody slips up, says something silly, says something stupid, and hurts the other partner. And instead of quickly apologizing, excusing themselves and trying to fix up, they do what people sometimes do, which is double down and spiral and get into that mess. And before you know it, both partners are offended. They're not talking to each other. They're in pain. It's not okay. A few days go by, and I don't know who helps them with their choices, but they go to the airport, they get on a plane, and they still can't look each other in the eye. They go to Hawaii, they get to the resort, it's exactly as described, but they're both miserable. Heaven is not heaven anymore. The heaven they imagined is now hell. The experience has changed. So what's heaven and what people might call hell? We have to stop looking at it as different places. There are no places in the spiritual, conceptual reality of the soul. Two souls might be in the same place. Their experience of that place is what's different. Remember that a soul is a divine energy. A soul is a godly experience. A soul is a sense of godliness. That's where its energy comes from. That's energizing us. After its passing, the soul is trying to go back into that godly embrace to come home. And that's really should be a very blissful experience for the soul, coming back to where it belongs most, into the place where it's loved most, the place where it fits most. But sometimes, most times, people have made mistakes in their lifetimes. And that soul has violated its relationship with the God from which it emerged by making the wrong choices in life. And now that it comes back to God's embrace, it doesn't feel very comfortable. there's a shame and there's a pain, just like those two spouses. That pain and that shame is actually the core of what we call Gehenna, which might be described as hell. It's an unbearable shame, and it's an unbearable sense of, what did I do to the other? Why did I bring us to this place? So there are no angels with pitchforks taking revenge from anybody, but there is an eternal pain of coming to face with it all. But the good news is that it's temporary, very temporary. As we mentioned, the maximum it can go on for is 12 months. We assume up to 11. The previous Rebbe writes it's usually much shorter than that. And that's because hell is actually the wrong word. A better translation for Gehenna would have been purgatory, a place where we get cleaned up, a place where we face the inner demons, we own up to our mistakes, a place where, if you go back to that couple, you finally have the courage to go through the pain, apologize, own up to what happened, even though it hurts and even though it's hard. And that's what cleanses it off and frees you from it and allows you to truly experience the heaven of that relationship. Before I get told that we ran out of time, we'll stress the happier side. What actually happens after that hopefully very short, painful process? Well, here's where the soul is experiencing greater, deeper, and potentially endless divine closeness and warmth. And that can go deeper and beyond because, of course, there's an infinite potential to everything that's divine. But that's fueled by the mitzvahs that we've done here in this life. Remember that a mitzvah means connection. So mitzvah is a point where we connect to the God who commanded us to do that mitzvah. We accumulate many of those connections in this world, and we experience the full intensity of that bond after the passing of the soul, after the soul moves on, because the body has died. And that's why there's no soul that's not disappointed that it didn't do at least one more mitzvah. Now experiencing its true value and the true depth of it, something we can not really imagine in our lives. There's always that sense that it could have done a little more. But the good news is that we can still help. We who live in this life, in this world, in the real playing field, when we do a mitzvah for the sake of a loved one, really for the sake of anybody who's departed, we're contributing the energy of our mitzvah. Don't worry, we don't lose it either. We're contributing that energy to fuel their continuous connection and spiritual experience in the reality that they're in. Because remember, the real thing is happening here. And that's why, again, in Jewish tradition, as much and as valuable and as beautiful as afterlife might be, it's really about this life. And hopefully he's moving and still alive in this world. Because if you imagine, as a final analogy, a scientist who's come up with a cure, a miracle cure for every type of cancer or some other dreaded disease, and he's saving potentially thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives. And he gets, of course, the Nobel Prize. And it's beautiful and it's wonderful. It's a nice prize. The money won't hurt anyone. And there's the prestige and there's the presentation and his family is there. And it's wonderful. And he really enjoys that experience. But when you compare that to the experience of actually succeeding in saving all those lives, in curing all those diseases, it just doesn't compare. It's nice to be recognized for it. It's nice to be rewarded for it. But what really matters in such a valuable case is the accomplishment. Well, the accomplishment is what we do in this life. In the afterlife, in another experience, we might benefit from it. Our loved ones benefit from our continued accomplishments, but the accomplishment happens here. And that's why, in the coming of Mashiach, hopefully very soon, everybody's back here. That's why Judaism believes that every soul comes back to experience the goodness of this world, because this is where the ultimate making a difference, making this world a better place, making our own lives and the lives of those around us better by another mitzvah. This is where it could be done. So let's cherish every moment and use it to its fullest. And thank you.
Wonderful, Sholom D. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions that I have here that people have shared, and I will ask people to continue to share questions with me unless you want to, if you're familiar with raising your hand on Zoom, there is a reaction at the bottom of your screen towards the bottom to the right. If you scroll down, you should be able to raise your hand. But Rabbi Notik, so I'm reading, this is fascinating. Thank you so much for this, really appreciate it. I'm having trouble with understanding the time in heaven. You said that the maximum time is 12 months or 11 months of hell, but is there time in heaven? And there's a second part, but I'm going to stop at the first part to this question.
So the rabbi was wise for stopping in the first part, because this is a great question. In fact, it's too good of a question, because how do we understand the concept of time in a place where there cannot be time, because it's a spiritual reality? So the truth to be told, in Kabbalah, there is discussion of the roots of time that do exist, even in a spiritual dimension. And that's not time as we know it, that can be measured on a clock, but it's a concept of before and after. It's a concept of moving from one position to another. So if you're in one position or in one state, and then in another state, that change is the only equivalent that a spiritual world would have to time. But putting that aside as a complex concept for another time, what I think is most important is that the time is measured again by our world. When we say time, it's a measurement in our world. The equivalent for that in the spiritual place is actually different. But because our world is so important, when time changes in this life, it actually makes a real difference in the spiritual dimension. So when it's Shabbos in our world, even though there are no days and no 7 days and no weeks, in a spiritual reality for God, for angels, for souls, for you name it, when it's Shabbos here, there is an experience of Shabbos in every dimension. Because again, the real thing is here, the mitzvahs happen here. This is the place that God's watching and looking for. So when 11 months go on here and we say Kaddish during those times, that contribution has that impact as much as it's needed in the other world, even though there it can't be measured in time. So I hope that helps.
I think it does, and I think it maybe will shine some light on the second part of the question, is what is a day like in heaven or hell?
You mean,
what are they doing?
The schedule?
What?
What's the schedule?
What's the schedule?
Well, in some visions or imaginations of it, it's a full day of golf on the best course you can imagine. And I live on 2 golf courses, so that's the best example. But what we do know a little bit about the daily schedule, again, relates to our daily schedule, and that's the 3 prayers. So we have Shacharis in the morning, we have the Mincha later on, and then, of course, Ma'ariv prayer all the way after dark. Those prayers are things that happen in our world and on our clock. But we are taught that at the time of each prayer, souls experience elevation. They get closer to God. They have a greater spiritual experience at each of those moments. So there is some kind of daily routine going on there, because at those stages during our life, and the same as, again, for Shabbos during our life and other stages that we know, their experience changes, and that means is upgraded. And that's actually why a soul can be going through what you might call a dizzying elevation, because if you add all those 3 times a day for years and years and years, you get pretty far.
Okay, thank you for that. So moving around from topic to topic here, if you can, I know it's not directly germane to our class, but tonight or to our lecture, can you touch on the subject? Do Jews believe in angels? And how does that relate to the afterlife, if it does? I know it's a big topic, so.
It's a great topic because it touches on one of my favorite anecdotes. And that's where the yeshiva student shows up at 11 a.m. instead of 7 for the first session. And the rabbi calls him over immediately and says, "What's going on here? You're 4 hours late." And the boy just says, "It happens. I wake up late. Things are going on. I'm not an angel." And the rabbi says, "That's right. You're not an angel, but souls are greater than angels." So yes, there is a concept of an angel. We read about it in this week's Torah portion. There is a spiritual being, which is again really just a spiritual energy, most comparable to our souls, that might be doing things on someone or something's behalf, might have a mission from God. It does exist. We read about it, we mention it in the prayers every day. But let's remember 2 things. Let's remember that it's wholly spiritual. There's no fire and brimstone and no fire and flapping wings. Those are all conceptual ideas. And B, let's remember that as wonderful or as pure and spiritual and free of a sense of ego or any negativity that an angel might be, a soul is the ultimate. It's the soul that has the power to make a difference by making the right choices.
Thank you. You mentioned about the pain that a soul would go through in cremation. Is this only true of a Jewish soul? Is this also true of a Gentile soul?
It's a very interesting question that I've seen discussed and not really conclusively addressed, I should say. On the one hand, ultimately, everything boils down to the mitzvah. The mitzvah being the biblical requirement for burial, which is the ultimate reason why we do burial and nothing else, because the Torah actually spells out, "Bury you shall bury on that day." So that is the mitzvah. And mitzvahs, with the exception of the 7 core laws that are basics for civilization, mitzvahs only apply to the Jewish people, to our tradition. So we wouldn't be able to say that a non-Jew is obligated in one or another form of burial. They have the option to do it as they choose. On the other hand, the core idea of burial begins with Adam, begins with the first human, begins with the Torah saying that a human is created from the earth and should be returned to the earth. So conceptually, that should apply to all humans. So I would imagine, and remember those words because I'm imagining, and I can't sign off for it as a textually based, but I would imagine that it's of benefit for all people to choose burial because that's ultimately the natural human way.
Yeah, I believe there is, I have to find that as a source, there's certainly a medrash that talks about the responsibility that even a Gentile has to bury their loved one. But thank you. After 12 months, I think you mentioned this, but I'm going to read the question. And so 12 months have passed and you've said Kaddish, you've helped the soul with mitzvahs. Does your continued mitzvahs help or benefit the soul in any way?
Well, this is the question where I get to say absolutely yes. It's interesting to note that there's a formula of sorts, and that is that the mitzvahs of children or any descendants of the soul automatically benefit the soul, even if we don't want to share them, even if we're not thinking about the loved one at that time. The descendant's existence is credited to the ancestor, and so the mitzvahs we do are of benefit to that ancestor. But for anybody else, we always have the option to share the mitzvah and say, we're dedicating this mitzvah to their memory and to their soul, to their benefit, as Jews have always done. And that goes beyond the 12 months and is a benefit for all time. In fact, that's why we say Kaddish every year on the yard site again and follow numerous potentially additional customs on that time, because our ability to have an impact is not diminished.
Okay, interesting question. In talking about the relationship between those who have passed, whether a direct relative or someone else, there was an unresolved issue between two individuals, or one did something to another. Are they still mad at us? Are they still, how tethered are we in that relationship? And what can we do about it?
Yeah, well, this is a very personal question. So we all have to think about what we can each do better in any kind of such scenario. It could be a very painful question for people to walk around with. I had the experience to do a funeral for a fellow I did not know, but basically everybody told me nobody likes him, but his former partner is looking out for the burial just to, be nice. But there's baggage that everybody has, and it's going to be uncomfortable and all of that. And I struggled with it until I really made the focus on a critical and I think beautiful Jewish tradition that associates to every funeral or passing, and that is the idea of forgiveness. When the individual is being buried, there are different points where this could potentially be done. We should be asking for forgiveness for anything that may or may not have been the way it should, and we should be granting forgiveness. Because remember that the soul is now spiritual. It leaves the body behind. The physical condition, the imperfections of the human body are what caused those mistakes. Nobody really wanted to do them. The soul never really chose them. It's the influence of the imperfect physical life and nature and nurture that people have. When the soul is no longer in the body, it no longer has that potentially ego, sense of self, narcissism, whatever it was that caused those mistakes. It's now looking at it differently. But our negative feeling could still bog the soul down. By us saying, we're still hurt, that is, in a sense, held against the soul. So traditionally, we're forgiving the soul to free it up to ascend, and we are asking the soul to forgive us. And that's also beneficial for the soul, not to leave any baggage of sorts behind. But I think in the bottom line, for us to remember is that point. The soul is now purely spiritual, which also means purely good. The mistakes are product of the body that has been left behind. So it certainly wants to be on a new page of the relationship. We can be sure that that's what the soul is feeling. And it's up to us to find the strength in ourselves to also do it on our side. We know the soul's forgiving us. We know the soul is now in the place of all good. Let's try to also be there with that soul. Practically speaking, there is a Jewish tradition, and it has halachic implications that if somebody did something they should not have to someone else, and the victim has passed on, they should visit the grave. There's a protocol to follow and ask forgiveness that has an impact. They should also seek to help the family of the wronged individual So there are tools in which to right things that are wrong. We don't need to walk around with that pain and just feel like it is too late. There definitely are solutions, and it's in our power to say it's going to be good from here on.
Wonderful, wonderful. So that leads directly into the next two questions, and I'll put them together. Praying or asking for blessings, asking for loved ones or someone who's passed on their blessings. Does it actually help us? When we ask for their blessings, does it matter? Does it matter to them? Does it help us? Does it matter to us? Does it actually, is there anything there?
Okay, this is a good one. So technically, when we pray at a gravesite, what we're doing is what we touched upon earlier. We're asking the soul to pray for us. We never ever pray to a soul or to anyone but God. We're asking the soul to pray for us. We're asking the soul to use its spiritual condition, its closeness to God, to kind of represent us. So that's the core of it. That's what we should be doing in visiting a grave. That's the formula. But asking for a blessing of a soul, although it's a bit of an interesting way to do it, it actually would fit right in with the concept we read about just last week in the Parsha, where God tells Abraham, and by extension every Jew, that those who bless you will be blessed. And that means that when any individual blesses a fellow Jew, God blesses the one giving the blessing, and also concurs and supports the blessing given to the other. So that's why we might all be just simple, regular people. And how can we bless? Where do we draw the power to give a blessing to someone else? But nevertheless, we do it all the time. And when we wish each other well, and when we get together and we truly, and we mean it, and we share a blessing with the other person, it has that impact because God supports it. So we should be doing it, and to ask a departed soul to do it on our behalf would seem to fit right into that. So I would suggest that there is an impact there, and it can be taken advantage of.
Wonderful. Rabbi Notik, this has been fantastic and informative and insightful. And I didn't mention at the beginning, but this is part of the annual Fred and Edith Goldsmith Jewish Pride Lecture. And listening to you gives me a lot of Jewish pride and familiar pride. But it also, I'm sure, instills with us a sense of the bigger picture. And I hope we all have learned. Every Monday night at 8 p.m., you can tune in here to do some wonderful weekly studies and learning and great discussions. Starting November 2nd, we will be giving a 4-part series on anti-Semitism. I hope you will join. Have a wonderful week, everyone. God bless you all. Thank you, Rabbi Sholom D.
Thank you. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
And a good night.
And we'll see you all. Be well.
God bless. Thank you. Wonderful. Good night, everyone. Good night, Robin and Sherry and Ronnie and Rachel and Ira and Lara and iPad Anita and iPhone, Frida and Andy and Rochelle.